Welcome to the Paradox of Informal Urbanism webinar series for 2021. My name is Crystal Legacy. I'm Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Melbourne, and I'm also the Deputy Director of the Informal Urbanism Research Hub, which is hosting this webinar today. Before we go any further, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Colin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people in the audience today. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Colin McFarlane with us today. Colin's work will be well known to all of us. His work on exploring the politics of the city, political infrastructures, the city as an assemblage, has had a tremendous influence in the study of urban politics, and indeed in the ways in which we think about informality and city life across the work we do here at InfUr. His work has produced many books on topics including smart urbanism, infrastructural lives, and urban navigations. And his recent work examines how high densities are shaped and lived in urban domains, including in public spaces, which I think positions him very well to reflect on the impacts of COVID-19 on our urban lives. This brings me to the title of Colin's seminar today, which is The Crowd, Being Together in a Time of Crisis, where he'll reflect on the how the pandemic has unsettled the relations of density and crowd and formal and informal urban thinking. I very much look forward to your seminar today, Colin. Thank you very much for joining us, and let me now pass the virtual floor to you.
Okay, thank you, Crystal, and thanks everyone for the organisation of this seminar and for coming along to this. So I'm going to try and share my screen and hopefully, oops, that's not what you want to see, that one there. Share that and hopefully you can see the presentation. Yep, people nodding. So just go from the start of that. Right, yeah, okay. So yeah, okay, thanks, Crystal. So I'm going to talk about this idea of the crowd, and I want to reflect on work that I've been doing with colleagues here that Crystal mentioned on this research project that looks at urban density and the crowd as part of that. It's a project that's been running for a couple of years now. It's funded by the European Research Council, and we're particularly interested in the relationship between sort of everyday life and urban densities. Obviously, the pandemic has had a huge impact on those experiences and geographies. So I want to talk about that today, and hopefully to provoke some questions around that. And the kind of informal formal, I think, will feature sort of in the kind of background of some of that, and hopefully we'll draw out towards the end of it and into discussion if we want to go into that in more detail. So the crowd itself, we've talked this seminar series, of course, the paradox of informality, kind of examines the ways in which informality features both as a kind of discourse of dystopian urbanism on the one hand, for example, and also this kind of discourse of entrepreneurial liberation or expression on the other. We tend to see these kind of political valences attached to categories of the informal. So too is the crowd, in a sense, a kind of paradoxical notion right at the heart of the history of urban thinking. In fact, it's difficult to sort of understand the history of cities, I think, without paying attention to the idea of the crowd. The crowd is a paradox in the sense that it is both seen as an ongoing, stubborn problem for urban management, so a phenomenon that is difficult to control, that is excessive, that disrupts, that doesn't play by the rules enough of the time. And so particularly for the history of conservative urban management, but for cities in general, the crowd has been, to some extent, a problem. And it's also been, at the same time, seen as a space of liberation and possibility, an expression of different political and social creativity, views, aspirations, and so forth. So the crowd itself then is a paradox. And there's a long history in sort of social psychology, but also in sociology around the crowd that many of us are aware of, much less literature actually in my own sort of field in geography around the histories of crowds in the city. And that work has shown, for example, how the history of urban thought has been caught up in part with an attempt to control the masses, to control, for example, the industrial working class, to view the crowd both as a political contaminant, but also as a kind of public health contaminant. So the crowd is both a political threat, but also as a threat against the kind of like the health and well-being of the larger city, for example, for a disease outbreak and so on. Long histories of this, both in kind of like colonial and metropolitan cities. And at the same time as a liberatory and expressive space. So the crowd then is caught up with a history of urban politics, a history of the city, which is as much about affect and passion as it is about reason and consensus. And this is kind of the starting point, I suppose, of how I'm trying to position these reflections around the pandemic in this larger historical context of the crowd. And I think what's kind of important about some of the work we're sort of looking at the moment in terms of some of the changes that's happening at the moment in cities, and I'm going to be talking, I should say, mainly about research in British cities that we're doing at the moment as part of the project, is the ways in which the experience and management of the crowd through the pandemic is provoking fundamental questions about urban liberalism and urban value, and potentially changing these categories in kind of long-term ways. Or at least that's one of the questions we're grappling with, is what's the kind of longer-term shifts that we're seeing on cities through the pandemic vis-a-vis the crowd, right? So how does the management of the crowd, the experience of the crowd, the public debate around the crowd factor into the reconfiguration, if that's what we're seeing, of notions of liberalism and value in the city? And these are obviously very broad categories. In some ways, they're kind of sort of unwieldy and ill-fitting categories, but I'm thinking about these categories as ways of describing, on the one hand, the balance of control and autonomy in the city. So liberalism as a kind of, as a sort of a politics of freedom in the city. Thinking about Patrick Joyce's work, for example, some of you may know from urban history. And thinking about urban value as a sort of question of prioritization. You know, what matters most to cities and to urban futures? And here, value, of course, is always about some kind of measure or extraction, but it's also seen, it's also a resource, it's also a form of gathering and coming together, which exceeds capitalist value. So it's both about kind of appropriation through capitalist value, but it's also something else. Value always carries something more with it. In terms of social possibilities, commoning in the city, and so on and so forth. So those two categories of liberalism and value are sort of in the background to a lot of what I want to say here, and they kind of factor through this kind of question of the crowd and the pandemic. And a lot of this also comes back to a sort of politics of visibility, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But the ways in which the crowd does or does not become visible in political and public debate matters, I think, for some of the future questions around liberalism and value in the city. Okay, so the research context, as I was saying, is this project, which we call Density, which looks at the experiences of density in different cities across the world. I've been working with various colleagues here in Durham, postdoctoral researchers as part of that project, looking mainly Asian cities, but also beyond Asia into Europe and North America, for example. And today I want to talk about the work I've been doing with some postgraduates here in the department at Geography at Durham, where we've been looking at Birmingham, Edinburgh, Liverpool, Manchester, and Newcastle, so a kind of clutch of northern cities, and conducting interviews and surveys with residents and policymakers and others, you know, kind of private actors, the police, all kinds of groups, around the management and experience of the crowds throughout the pandemic. And that's with Abby Joyner, Ludovica Rella, and Michelle Uriarte-Ruiz. So we're going to talk about some of that work as part of what I say here. The crowd then I see as a particular kind of expression of high density urbanism. It's not equivalent to density, but it's part of a kind of larger sort of repertoire of densities in the city. If density itself tends to be understood in relation to the formal, the kind of like the sort of realm of modernist urban governance and management, regulating, for example, provisions of housing or infrastructure, transport, and so forth across the city. The crowd tends to be linked historically to the informal, the realm of the kind of informal, where it seemed to be, as I was saying at the start, more likely to be improvisatory, elastic, disruptive in one way or another, or at least having those potentials far more than density itself, which has seemed to come into a kind of civic management realm of formal urbanism. And Fadean Sujic, whose book The Language of the Cities talks a little bit about this relation of the crowd in the city. The crowd is a kind of signature of the city itself. The crowd kind of mirrors this sort of unwieldy, unpredictable nature, the volatility of the city itself. So the crowd is almost like kind of a metaphysics of the city for Sujic there. And the pandemic, of course, disrupts all of this. It's a kind of fascinating time to be asking questions about density in general and crowds specifically, I think, because we've sort of shifted from a kind of celebration of density writ large in the city in much of sort of urban policy and mainstream urban thinking pre-pandemic, where there was a kind of a sort of, not quite a consensus, but a kind of like promotion of versions of compact urbanism and densification as good for the city, good for climate change, good for social cohesion, good for economic agglomeration, and so on and so forth. A solution to all kinds of problems, to a situation where density and the crowd as part of that is seen very much as the fundamental problem of cities, that cities incessantly produce gatherings and crowds which need to be eviscerated from the urban landscape because of the public health risk. So right at the start of the pandemic, of course, this becomes lockdowns and a discourse of apprehension about the ways in which the city forms crowds. So this is Andrew Cuomo, for example, the former governor of New York, talking about New York as a crowd, a place where people are constantly coming into contact with one another, touching surfaces, sharing the subway, picture the city in daily life. He talks about the kind of very notion of this sort of thrown togetherness, as Doreen Massey puts it, of the city as a problem. So then the work that we're doing is looking very much at this in the UK, and the ways in which the sort of initial decrowding of the city sort of follows through into the experience and politics of crowds over time. So the sort of question we started was really with what is the kind of biography of the crowd, if you like, in the pandemic? And we were asking, residents and different groups across the city, across these different cities in the northern part of the UK, what their kind of pandemic biographies were of the crowd. So what crowds meant to them, what reactions and relations they attached to them. And we looked also at municipal plans, so city-based plans, to try to kind of control and prevent crowds. And we looked at formal processes like outbreak plans. Every city has to have an outbreak plan to prevent outbreaks of COVID, and how they tried to design out crowds in different kinds of ways, and to prevent kind of these kind of ruptures of the crowd in the city for different reasons, whether it's for economic or political or social reasons. But also how those plans then get rewritten and redrafted and tweaked as the city kind of continually bites back, as kind of like cities always have, exceed those formal restrictions and formal boundaries, and crowds kind of emerge and groups gather, and it creates these kind of flashpoints, these kind of political flashpoints. Some of the most significant political flashpoints in cities over the pandemic have been around moments of rupture where crowds have appeared. And this is why liberalism is, I think, this question of the rebalancing of liberalism, I think, is quite important. So the pandemic then has positioned the crowd right at the heart of political debate and public imaginations. So I want to talk about the pandemic crowd in relation to sort of four forms, and then kind of end with a sort of crowd beyond the crowds. And I'll explain what I mean by that when I get there in the time that I've got. And a lot of this comes down to what's visible. So much of the political debate has been a response to the sheer visibility of the crowd in the city during the pandemic. But there's also then a kind of knock-on effect of that in terms of the crowds which are, or the forms of crowding, which are less visible in the city, and the attention they do or do not then receive in terms of the politics of the city and questions of social justice and so on and so forth. So the first form, and perhaps most obvious form of crowd management, if you will, is around the material rearrangements of urban space. And this is something we're all familiar with in our different cities in different ways now. Just a quick couple of examples: the sort of repurposing of urban infrastructure, one-way systems, expanded walkways and cycleways, spatial controls and limits on buses and trains and so on. So the kind of remaking of the urban fabric through these kind of temporary repurposed infrastructures to prevent infection, as well as all the material additions of hand sanitizers, face coverings, and so on. So this kind of materialization, this kind of substrate of control over the crowd has, of course, a much longer history. If you look at, for example, work in urban history and sociology, you see history around the ways in which infrastructure gets woven into the production of urban liberalism and control and freedom. So we see that history happening in different points. The pandemic is a particular intensification of materialization of crowd management. Secondly, there's a form of the crowd that we're also familiar with, which is the kind of debate around population and immunization. And here there's a much more diffuse notion of crowds, where it's much more about de-risking the crowd. So creating situations in cities, and we see lots of discourse around this in, for example, some of the interviews with policymakers, around making crowds safe, making it safe to go into a crowded situation, whether it's a shop or a cafe or a train or some kind of social gathering, a festival, whatever it might be in the city, through immunization, through vaccinating effectively populations. And debates there as well about at which point we get to herd immunity that go back and forth in the UK about immunity thresholds, about when crowds become safe or not, when we can make that judgment, and the kind of medicalisation of that debate that we see in the UK and beyond. But also a kind of attached to that, a kind of targeting of particular kinds of populations, at-risk populations, for example, attached to sort of overcrowded spaces, care homes, prisons, also some domestic living arrangements or working arrangements, and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of second clutch of debates there, which I'll pick up again a bit later. And thirdly, there's a kind of debate around the crowd in relation to urban conduct and governmental power. So here we see less kind of controls in terms of, say, lockdowns and restrictions, and more of a kind of appeal to civic duty, a kind of invocation of civic care as a way of kind of organising crowds. So, for example, the current Health Secretary in the UK, Sajid Javid, has talked about how the government needs to switch from controlling people's everyday behaviours to asking people to take personal responsibility. And of course, very loaded term, personal responsibility, and a highly differentiated and uneven one. But his argument being, I shouldn't have to tell you to wear a face mask as a government minister, but if you are in a situation where people might feel uncomfortable and you don't wear one, then this is a lack of care, effectively, for your fellow citizens. So this kind of governmentalization's appeal to kind of a new form of urban conduct. And this came through very strongly in our interviews, where people would say time and time again in our interviews that, it's not very difficult to kind of like stay away from the crowd, or to behave appropriately in a group, to keep your distance, to wear a mask. It's not hard, it's caring for yourself and others. And that kind of discourse came through sort of very strongly in the interviews. And related to that, a very strong discourse in the interviews was around a sort of moralizing social imaginary around crowds. So, for example, perhaps more than any other theme in the interviews we did across the cities that we've been working in, was this kind of description of crowds as being selfish and irresponsible, as not to be trusted, and these kind of discourses often attached to sort of longer lasting prejudices around particular groups. So especially younger groups, teens, people in their early 20s, who were seen to be forming crowds in public squares, in the neighbourhood, in parks, outside of pubs, at festivals, or even protesting. Typically, this description of younger people who are putting their own interests, whether it's social, political, or economic, ahead of the public health of the wider city, and acting in a way which is irresponsible. And sometimes this was being attached to kind of notions of class, so it's a working class younger people, and also occasionally, although less often, attached to discourses around Black, Asian, or ethnic minority groups. So longer standing urban prejudices are being kind of catalysed, intensified around the kind of moments of crowd appearance in the city. That's what came up through some of these interviews. At the same time, changing notions of the crowd itself. So a few people reflected, for example, that what they previously would see as a small gathering of people, they now saw as kind of a crowd. So this kind of shifting of sort of ordinary gatherings into extraordinary crowds, which is kind of about the intensification of fear and apprehension around crowds in the city. And through this debate, what we start to see, of course, is the role of the crowd as a spectacle. And probably we're all familiar with different versions of this in different parts of, different cities. But, in the UK, the kind of British media, for example, pinpointing particular moments where crowds appeared. And this might be a festival, it might be a party for New Year's, it might be football fans celebrating in the street, it could even be kids gathering for kind of skiing over or sledging over the winter months. But this kind of sort of shaming of public crowds in the city, which enters into these moral imaginaries and these discourses of the crowd through the pandemic. And of course, much of that happening as well sort of online, where you kind of get these kind of angry discourses where people are kind of sort of evaluating the crowds kind of over and over in the pandemic and forming these kind of judgments, which are also rooted in these longer histories. So across these interviews, then the crowd surfaces in all kinds of ways. But I guess three things just to kind of point out from what I'm saying here. One is that the crowds and versions of it, and sometimes we're talking about quite small gatherings of people who are being described as a crowd, are seen to be amplifying risk. So this is across all the interviews, that basically what the crowd does is that it maximizes the possibility of proximity. It creates enhanced chances of stumbling across someone in your personal space. It produces greater respiratory potential, if you like, for infection. A second notion that comes through these interviews very strongly is the notion that people are projecting longer standing prejudices onto the crowds, as I was saying, especially particular social groups. And thirdly, that the crowd sort of is constantly is a figure of kind of the misbehaving nature of cities. That that it's kind of like an expression of the city's refusal to obey the rules, right? That the crowd becomes a rupture of regulatory codes. The kind of informal biting back against the formal regulation of the city. So almost willfully disobedient. And this kind of then spills over, of course, into a debate about policing and how to then control the disruptive city. So I suppose the question becomes, when appeals to conduct, when appeals to civic care fail, how do we police the crowds? How do we prevent it from happening? When the formalities of outbreak plans and municipal strategies and materializations of crowd management fail, how do we control the crowd through policing? So these kind of discourses have only intensified in the UK over the pandemic and become much stronger. So, for example, there's been a huge increase in fines, coronavirus notices against, not surprisingly, especially younger people, especially young Black, Asian, ethnic minority groups who have been fined for gatherings, sometimes huge fines, way beyond the kind of affordability of many of these people. And you see this kind of intensification again of a longer history of certain groups being targeted as kind of unruly, as a risk, as a hazard in the city in some way or another, through the pandemic, especially younger, racialized, class-based kind of notions of crowding. And this then pulls on to the kind of fourth and final kind of notion of the crowd, which I think is important for the UK experience of the pandemic crowd, and that's around sovereign power, and which increasingly has been turned to as the pandemic unfolded over the sort of 18 months of it in the UK in urban contexts, the role of the police in managing crowds and preventing crowds. And what we've seen in the UK, and perhaps this resonates with also some of the Australian experience, is a kind of shift from a sort of temporary imposition of crowd control and prevention to a more permanent shift, which, this goes back to this question of the rebalancing of urban liberalism, of effectively of urban expression and freedom in the city. So at the end of last year, the government, for example, was saying that it needed temporary legislation to prevent protests from happening. It was particularly worried about protests. It was also partly worried about crowds of people on a Friday night when the pubs closed, gathering in public squares. But what was really driving the government's concern at the end of last year was protests. So we'd had Black Lives Matter protests, we'd had Extinction Rebellion, we'd had a range of protests around gender violence, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the government was becoming increasingly uneasy about the public health risks about this. So the government said, as a temporary measure, we're giving the police more power to prevent crowds from forming. So if the police thinks a protest might form, they will have the power to stop it in advance on public health grounds. But this was seen to be temporary. However, as time wore on, it was also clear that this was a permanent shift. And in many respects, this has always been the government's intention. We have a Conservative government here that has a deep suspicion of crowds, and it goes back to kind of longer histories of the crowd. So typically the government will talk about the crowd as a mob. A protest is typically described as mobs because the notion of the mob is coded to a much longer Conservative history of a violent, disruptive force rather than a peaceful protest, for example. So we've had the Police Crime Sentencing in Courts Bill, which is kind of a bit of a mouthful, which was passed in July this year in the House of Commons, despite huge amounts of, ironically enough, huge amounts of protest against it. This is a bill that basically gives the police the power to prevent protests permanently if the police thinks it will become disruptive. And by disruptive, this includes being noisy. So the notion of a protest being noisy is literally written into legislation as grounds for prevention of a protest. This is a radical shift in British politics, and it goes straight to the heart of the question of the city, of urban liberalism, of the kind of history of the right to express and protest and assemble in British cities. So it's a really radical change. And so the government is using the pandemic strategically to instigate a new form of crowd management through sovereign power. It's very controversial. The Joint Committee on Human Rights, which is staffed by MPs across political parties in the House of Commons, said this is an attack on a fundamental right to protest. It goes to the heart of democracy in the country. And it goes back to a longer history, as the committee pointed out, of crowd management and crowd control tactics by Conservative governments and indeed Labour governments in the UK. For example, around kettling, that some of you may be aware of, which really emerged in earnest in the early 2000s as a way of kind of crowd control, literally kind of like trapping protesters for hours on end without water or access to toilets and so on and so forth. So in a way, this has been coming, this legislation, and the pandemic was an opportunity to do it. And much of this is animated again by this kind of mediated spectacle of the crowd. So it certainly helped the government that there was the apprehension in the public and media debate around people gathering and crowding in the city. So those kind of that kind of sort of ream of that kind of resonance machine of sort of imagery in the media and social media of crowds being evaluated and condemned by all kinds of voices in cities over the past 18 months helped the government make its case for why this was necessary, right? That we need to stop these kind of situations from forming. So you have a kind of bleeding into the crowd as a threat in terms of health, into the notion of the crowd as a threat in terms of politics, right? So again, these are, as I said at the start, very old ideas, this twin notion of the crowd as a threat both to public health through disease and illness, and especially working class crowds, being a threat to public health and a threat to public order and to kind of like the political stability of the city. So these kind of twin threats, kind of the government's harnessing this, I think, in this moment. So Priti Patel, for example, the Home Secretary, makes the point that Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter are, in any case, they're bringing anarchy to our streets, right? This isn't just, I mean, of course, it's important for public health grounds to control crowds, but aren't these people also bringing anarchy to our streets? Don't they need to be stopped? People need to get to work in the morning and they're stopping people getting on the train, that kind of discourse. So this, I'm going to wrap up soon, but this kind of came to a head whilst we were doing the interviews. So it came through very strongly in many of the transcripts, and it's fascinating to see how different people reacted to these kind of new forms of crowd control that were emerging. But in March this year, there was a kind of horrific case of a woman, Sarah Everard, who was killed by a police officer in London. And this led to a massive national debate in the UK, and a number of peaceful vigils were held across the country where people would get together to kind of remember this woman who'd been killed, but also to kind of think about gendered violence more generally and to kind of try to raise more debate about the need for policy and political change around it. And so these were designed as vigils and described as vigils, so gatherings of people who would come together quietly. And they happen in many parts of the country, but the one in London that happened in Clapham Common, which is where her body had been found, the crowd that gathered there for the vigil wasn't given permission by the police to gather because the police said it could become potentially disruptive and that it wasn't right on public health grounds. So the police attended, asked them to disperse. The people refused to disperse. It led to a very aggressive scene, a number of arrests, and a huge kind of debate about the right of the police to kind of disrupt peaceful protests in the UK, just as this legislation was passing through the Commons, or about to pass through the Commons. And afterwards, the government committee looked at this. It came up with some really interesting kind of like reflections on the nature of the crowd in the city. For example, the police said that the crowd was hostile and that people were whipping up the crowd, and were using the kind of language of a crowd that was out of control. And again, the police were deliberately kind of describing this in a way which was encoded to a much larger history of crowds as, as losing, as kind of almost like mindless, losing their ability to act rationally, becoming violent, becoming potentially violent. So they had to intervene. Whereas attendees at the event told the same government committee inquiry that there was that actually we weren't a crowd, and one of the things that people were saying was that we were a group, and it's this kind of deliberate kind of attempt to almost speak back to the police, to speak back to a certain form of political power, historical political power in the city, which tries to condemn the crowd as potentially violent, by disowning the notion of the crowd, almost by kind of trying to sidestep this idea of the mob, and to say, no, we were a ordered, thoughtful, peaceful group of, we came together rationally and we behaved rationally and peacefully. So this notion of the group versus the crowd comes through in some of the government kind of inquiry report on this. And eventually the parliamentary inquiry concluded in June, just as the House of Commons was passing this horrific legislation, that the police had breached fundamental rights to protest and use disproportionate force. So throughout the pandemic then, these different kind of ideas, the group, the crowd, the vigil, the mob, the gathering, come through different interviews that we've done, whether it's with the police, whether it's with policymakers, or whether it's with residents themselves, and different political valences get attached to them. And the way this is then playing out raises much larger questions, of course, about the possibility of the right to protest and about where we position protest and freedom in relation to, say, public health, which is a larger question that's gone through cities through the pandemic. So just to close this example, we spoke to a police officer at the time in Manchester, a very senior officer involved in pandemic management in Manchester as part of our interviews. And you kind of start to see how the police themselves are wrestling with some of this. And he was saying, well, we had vigils here in Manchester, we let them happen. And we stood in the background, it was fine. But he was also quick to add, I'm very sympathetic to the London police, to the Met, because they've been put in an impossible position by the government. They're basically being told by the states that they have to stop protests in both public health and political grounds. He went on then to say, in any case, during a pandemic, public health trumps the human right protest and assemble. It's more important. And that was kind of certainly the position of much of the media. Also in the UK and in our interviews, people would normally put public health before protest. Although to some extent people were more sympathetic if they were supportive of the protests. So not surprisingly, they were less sympathetic to people protesting saying that COVID was a hoax, but maybe more sympathetic to Black Lives Matter protests, for instance. So those are four versions of thinking about the crowd, and I'm just going to wrap up now with this last point. There's also this kind of sort of fifth kind of domain of the crowd in the pandemic, which is to do with a less visible, more diffuse, more disparate notion of crowding. And this comes from the idea of overcrowding, which was a kind of quieter discourse through the pandemic here in the UK, but nonetheless present, and relates much more to the question of what Jay Pitter, the Toronto-based urbanist, has called forgotten densities, rather than the urban crowd of protest or assembly in city centres, for instance. So this is a crowd beyond the politics of spectacle, one that's less visible but is present and is part of the debate in the pandemic. And it's about overcrowded homes. So this is about homes where you have high rates of infection, hospitalisation and death in certain parts of the city. So it tends to be, in the cities we've been working in, it tends to be kind of sort of working class neighbourhoods. It's often Black, Asian and minority ethnic neighbourhoods as well, or predominantly. And these areas have been hit much harder in terms of infection than nearby sort of white middle class neighbourhoods. And so, there's been a debate about overcrowding and a kind of a politics which perhaps has become sort of rather peripheral, less visible certainly to the public debate, but which goes less to the question of liberalism and more to the question of value. Although of course those two concepts are closely related, about the kind of future of the city and about the kinds of spaces which get neglected or invested, the kinds of densities that we pay attention to and don't pay attention to in the pandemic debate. So there's been this vociferous debate about the right to protest. There's been less of a debate about overcrowding and its inequalities. There's been a growing kind of evidence base nonetheless showing that indeed overcrowding, especially in contexts where people have to work in jobs where you can't work from home. So you've got crowded homes, so-called overcrowded homes, where people are also having to go out to do the work of reproducing the city, in healthcare or public transport or garbage collection or whatever it might be, and having these higher rates of infection, hospitalisation and death. And there's been this debate then about value, about kind of what kinds of city we're sort of producing and how the pandemic might reframe that as we come out of the pandemic. And much of that debate has kind of like been anchored around sort of two camps. On the one hand, a kind of reformist camp, which is sort of arguing for the provision of better public space, for cycle lanes, walking paths and so on, ways of attracting people back into city centres, especially younger people and so on, from areas where there might be higher rates of unemployment, etc., etc. So, that kind of reformist debate we're all familiar with, and a much more transformational debate about how the disproportionate impact that kind of so-called overcrowded neighbourhoods have had from the pandemic demands a transformation to the larger politics of urban development. So demands a new approach to overcrowded, neglected homes, demands a new level of investment in neighbourhoods in the wider city. So that debate has been more peripheral, but includes radical changes to housing, to infrastructure investments, to land politics, involves a greater attention to the voices and knowledges and experiences of people living in those forgotten densities through participatory techniques. It involves much greater forms of integrated management spending in some of those areas. So this is partly a question of then coming out of the pandemic of how to keep those kind of less visible forms of density and crowding in the public and political view. And they get obviously a lot less attention in some of the politics I was talking about earlier around in relation to liberalism and freedom. And those of you who have sort of followed the debate on density, of course, will be aware that pre-pandemic there was kind of a large debate about how density was producing increasingly expensive exclusive housing. But these kind of more forgotten densities pushed often to the periphery of cities that we've been working in here in the UK. So the part of the question then is about how we think about the replacing of density itself in the public debate, right? So to what extent does the link between overcrowding and the pandemic play into a new politics of thinking about the future of urban densities and the management of them in relation to the political economies in the city? And just to wrap up then, so what we've been doing in this research is trying to figure out how the crowd features in the pandemic over time in the UK. We're looking at how the crowd as a paradox is kind of understood, both vilified and celebrated in different ways from different perspectives in the city, how it's managed and politicised. And we're trying to understand what the longer term consequences might be for debates about urban liberalism, but also trying to keep in view what I was just saying about urban value. You're trying to keep in view the kind of debate around overcrowdedness, these different kind of valences and notions of crowdedness in the city as a way of thinking about the future of social justice in our cities. And so I've been trying to think about, in this presentation, some of the different context drivers, spatialities and politics of the crowd in public space on the one hand, highly visible, and just at the end there, around the crowd, much less visible, around overcrowding in the home and in the neighbourhood. And I think part of the political challenge then is trying to connect these debates around liberalism and value as part of a larger repoliticisation, reprioritisation of urban life and politics in the city. So the questions that we're working with are larger questions then again around how the pandemic is impacting urban political, what kinds of openings and futures are emerging, the role of the state in all of that in different ways, both in terms of investment, but also in terms of control and policing and so on. The rebalancing of urban liberalism, if that's a long-term shift and what it looks like, whether or not a new politics of value might be emerging, what that looks like, and how the politics of visibility frames a lot of that in terms of what registers of the crowds in the city that we see, that are kept in view, that become part of the political and public debate and so on. So that's what we've been working on. Sorry for going over time slightly. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Colin. I might ask you to stop share your screen so we can see everyone.
Yeah,
that was fantastic. I just want to let our audience know that it's 6 a.m. in the morning, well now 7 a.m. For Colin. So that was an impressive presentation, animated with a lot of energy. So very much appreciate that. It was, you give us quite a lot to think about, particularly in the context of Melbourne, which is where I am at the moment, where we've been seeing quite a lot of crowding in the form of street protests, anti-lockdown, anti-mandatory vaccination. So no doubt that will be on a few minds, and perhaps we'll see a question in relation to that. If you do have a question, put your name in the chat and I will invite you to come and ask your question. We do have a bit of time, but look, I'll kick it off with my question first to Colin. One of the things that struck me, Colin, about the pandemic is its temporality. It's, it's 2 years, it's nearly 2 years in, and the level of exhaustion that people might be feeling, and certainly the amount of resources that's being required to manage police presence to do that decrowding work in the city. I'm wondering how time and temporality has shaped the ways in which the crowd is being addressed, the problem of the crowd being addressed, and how that, if you're seeing perhaps the formal tactics and strategies changing as people's general relationship to coming together is changing, and especially in the context of Freedom Day, now that your relationship to the pandemic has shifted there, you're not in lockdown, stay-at-home orders any longer.
Yeah. Thanks, Crystal. Well, in the interviews we did with, with people, with residents in these different cities that I mentioned here, one of the things that really struck us, because we did the interviews in different stages, sort of repeated over several months, trying to follow the pandemic sort of thing. And we couldn't always get the same people. But through those interviews, as I said, we were asking people to reflect back over the pandemic. So, imagine a situation where you encountered some kind of crowd in the city during the pandemic. How did you react? What was your feelings about that encounter? And it's really striking how dynamic people's relationship to the crowd is. So yes, there was this, some meta theme of kind of civic irresponsibility that came through the interviews. Not everybody by any means, but it was like a really dominant theme. And it might just be the people we spoke to, but a kind of recurring sense that, a crowd is a signature of people. It stands for people who aren't caring enough for the rest of us. So that was a meta theme. Nonetheless, like, I suppose what gave me some encouragement, was that these views weren't sort of fixed. So typically people would say that the summer after the pandemic started, so it started obviously in earnest in the kind of winter and spring. By the summer, when numbers were low, infection rates were low, and of course the kind of tracking of infection rates is quite important here for a lot of these perceptions nationally. They were much more relaxed about being in situations that were maybe sort of busy or lots of people milling around than they had been in the spring when the lockdown was sort of initiated. But then by the autumn, the kind of apprehension dial had been kind of like churned up. So you see a kind of ebb and flow of intensification as a relation to the crowd. And then particular events precipitate that also. So, at the end of the summer in 2020, we had a lot of Black Lives Matter protests happening. And there was a real kind of like intensification then in the interview material around, well, at this point, I feel really fed up with other people, or actually, I'm so proud of these people. They are risking their health and they're doing it because they care so deeply about issues which are more important than COVID. That was more of a minority view, but an intensification of kind of the passions attached to the crowd. And also, I think the last thing I would say about temporality is that, as I was trying to say in the presentation, there's been a deepening of sovereign control over crowds throughout the pandemic in the UK, and almost a kind of sense that, the government was surprised that people were so compliant with the lockdown initially, but as time went by and data was coming back saying that people were increasingly not following the rules, as by the time we hit the third lockdown, it was pretty clear that the government decided that it needed to ratchet up sovereign power, and there had to be much greater policing and resource going into policing to prevent people from forming crowds or to disrupt them for whatever reason, whether it was for a party or football fans or a protest or anything else. So you see at the same time as people like Sajid Javid, the health secretary, appealing to conduct, appealing to civic care, appealing to civic duty, appealing to personal responsibility, you also see at the same time this kind of ratcheting up in sovereign power. So in a sense, that kind of contradiction is intensified as the pandemic's gone on. I'm not sure, does that answer your question, Crystal?
Brilliantly, thank you, Colin. We've got a number of questions. So what I might suggest is we take 2 questions at a time, and maybe Colin, you can kind of bring the answers together if that works. We might first go to Alison Young, and then I'll invite Inji John to ask her question. So Alison.
Thanks, Crystal, and thanks, Colin, for a really fascinating talk. I've got a wee question about the aspect you were talking about to do with noise as a pretext for police to intervene or to prevent protests taking place. And while that statute that you've been talking about does contain something radically new in that it's very explicit about this, I just wanted to ask your thoughts about the fact that noise has been kind of in governmental discourse for a couple of decades now, thanks to antisocial behaviour orders and the sorts of things that they target, like loud music and so on. But also going back even further, the whole idea of the King's Peace, which is protected through laws such as those relating to breach of the peace and nuisance, and which have been long used in relation to protest and other kinds of public manifestations. So that the idea of peacefulness, peace and quiet and so on is like the antithesis of public disorder and has a centuries old history. So just your thoughts on any of that would be great.
Thanks, Alison. We might go to Inji as well, if that's okay, and take the two together. So Inji, over to you.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you, Colin, for a great presentation. So I have a question concerning the different cultural attitudes towards density. So kind of like a multicultural communities, their understanding of the individual may be different from liberalism in the sense that it's not so much about the atomistic individual, but more about the networks of families and kinships. So they might have more favorable attitude towards density. So, but this is just my hypothesis. So I'm just wondering what your field research speaks to this theme of different cultural attitudes towards density. Thank you.
Thank you, Inji. Colin, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think, Alison, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, antisocial behaviour orders and the kind of history of kind of controls around public disorder are partly, aren't they, about noise, and there's a longer history there about noise and disruption and protest or any kind of disruptive act, which it would be fascinating to kind of connect to kind of the ways in which that the pandemic legislation has emerged and how it's picking up on those histories. We haven't done that work, but I'll certainly try to kind of like dig into some of that because I think it's a really important question. I think what's sort of different here is that the legislation allows the police to disrupt, to prevent protests from happening through a very broad canvas of possible kind of reasons. So the police can say even a protest which has been where the protesters themselves have said that we intend to have a peaceful, quiet event which is static, where we'll assemble in one place and not move. There's no march. There's no need for the police to be aware of any routes through the city. We'll simply be assembling in one particular place peacefully. Even in that situation, the police can say that there is a potential for noise and disruption that means that it can prevent the protest from happening, or it can disrupt it as soon as it does. Whereas in the past, that kind of emphasis on the potential of disruption, even for protests which are static, for instance, was much more difficult for the police to do. So when we interviewed the police officer in Manchester, the quote of which I put up on the board, I mean, it was a fascinating conversation. And one of the things that he kind of said throughout it basically was that I'm extremely uncomfortable with these powers, and so, what he wasn't is sort of, the kind of classic image of the police officer desperate for more power in the city. He was much more ambivalent and kind of conflicted by this, but he felt, that it was inappropriate for him to have the power to stop a protest from assembling that had been, where the kind of like application to have it was kind of very explicitly about a peaceful vigil, for example, and talked about how they allowed some of these peaceful vigils to happen even whilst aware that they themselves might be on the edge of this legislation. So it's creating, I think you're right that it's a longer history and it needs to be situated better in that, and I think I do need to do that. But I think it's giving an extra level of prevention, which even people within the police are finding is kind of a stretch too far, or at least creates for them ambivalences and contradictions. So Inji, your question about, but there's a lot more to say there, Alison. I realise I've not quite resolved that. The issue around culture and density, Inji, that has been very much at the centre of what we're doing in the project. I mean, I didn't talk about this today, but for example, with Romit Chowdhury, we've been doing some work in Tokyo before the pandemic, looking at what we call crowd relations. So how people respond to crowds on the move. So this is really looking at commuting. So we spent a lot of time, looking at crowds in Shinjuku Station in Tokyo, and trying to kind of interview people about how they perceive the kind of journey, the commutes, the morning commutes, and the kind of the classic image of the Tokyo train network. The busiest network in the world being squeezed into these trains, and what's really powerful there is that a lot of the kind of cultural politics is kind of comes through in that. So, for example, we spoke to some South Asian migrants from Calcutta who are working in Tokyo, who would talk about how this isn't a crowd. This is order. This is calm. Try getting a train. Try getting a train in India, in Russia, in a city, and you'll really experience compression. And at the same time, very different views, of course, from some of the kind of Japanese respondents who we interviewed, and a lot of this mediated by gender, as well as kind of cultural differences. I'm sure you're aware that there's a massive problem with sexual harassment, for example, on the Japanese train network. So you get very radically different answers depending on who you speak to. If you speak to a young woman trying to commute to work versus a so-called sort of salaryman, office worker, you get very different stories about the same crowds. So there's kind of broad cultural differences, but also quite radical differences within particular groups of people in a city in their relation to the crowd. And I guess all of that means that we have to be quite careful about this notion of optimum densities that kind of still gets banded around. This kind of idea that, in a given city, you can find a culturally specific optimum for a density. One of the things that we found in some of the research we're doing in Bombay and Tokyo and Taipei, for example, is that people have very different ideas about what that looks like, and that if you look at crowd relations, if you look at people's experience and perception of crowds in the city, you don't get a singular response. You get kind of a radically plural kind of set of answers, even though there might be kind of meta themes, as I've been trying to say in the research, which does mean at least that planners and policymakers might want to try to learn from what residents themselves actually think of about crowds and densities before setting what they perceive to be optimums based on things like carrying capacity and so on and so forth.
Thanks for those questions, Alison and Inji. Now we've come up to the top of our hour, but Colin has agreed to stay on for an extra few minutes. So if you can stay on, please do. Otherwise, if you have to go to another meeting, thank you for joining us, and do have a look at our infur.org website. Our next speaker is going to be Fran Tontkis on the 3rd of November. So I think we've got a couple of questions here. We might take the two together. Kurt Iveson and Matt Novichevsky. So Kurt.
Hey, thanks, Crystal, and thanks, Colin. That was really, really interesting. And so much resonance with stuff that we're seeing going on around here at the moment, as Crystal was saying. But so I just want to ask about the sort of analysis of crowd policing that you've offered today. And it's like you say, I guess from what you're saying from your research and what we're observing around here too, I think there's all these different crowds, right? There's crowds of people partying at the beach. There's crowds of people having anti-vax protests and confrontations with police. There's Black Lives Matter. There's football crowds, etc. And so one of the things that I think, if I get you right, that you're saying is that, as you say, from a UK government perspective, and I think probably here too, the government just flattens all the differences between those crowds, sees them all as irresponsible, selfish threats to public health, and then increases police powers, increases financial penalties, and sends in the riot squad and the horses. And as you say, different crowds responding to try and get around that in different ways. Here in Sydney, when we were trying to protest against job cuts, educational activities were exempt from the crowd restrictions. So we had public teach-ins outside that looked close to protest but weren't, but because it confused the police enough to let us get away with it for a little while. But I guess my thing is, I'm still struggling, and I'd be really interested to get your thoughts about the frame that we would then bring to actually differentiate between crowds in a context where there is a pandemic and where crowds are risky for viral transmission. And it seems that if you break down even those crowds, to me, you know, some of them are actively refusing the idea that there is risk, that there is viral transmission, and that's what they're protesting against, that the whole thing's a conspiracy. Others are indifferent. And in the case of Black Lives Matters here, really consciously trying to say we can organise a safe protest, and particularly worried about the vulnerability of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and thinking about how you marshal a crowd to enable it to make its point and be safe at the same time. And like I say, just I'd be really interested to hear where your thinking's at about how we might not play the same game of flattening every crowd and analyse the differences when we're trying to critique the kind of sovereign control agenda.
Yeah, thanks, Gert. I mean, it is a really great question, and it's really difficult. I mean, part of me is aware of this, and part of me is kind of thinking, well, you know, the larger issue is the kind of permanent shift that seems to be happening, where the kind of like the pandemic is being used to kind of intensify a longer standing effort to clamp down on protest and disruption. And you know, there's some great histories. I don't know if any of you guys have read Christian Borch's book on the politics of crowds, which he's a sociologist, and he's kind of produced this fantastic history of sort of crowd management and crowd politics. And what's really kind of striking is just how persistent like efforts are to find ways of clamping down on disruption in the city, not always from conservative kind of governments, but you know, mainly from, because of this suspicion that crowds embody some kind of threat to the larger body politic, that they are sort of you know, the seeds of some radical rupture that will destabilize the kind of order of things. We know this history, of course, but to some extent. But I was struck by the kind of strategic use of different moments throughout time. You know, going back to cholera outbreaks or plague outbreaks, or you know, moments around industrial union uprising and so on, and the ways in which legislation tries to respond. You know, so I'm kind of like, so some of that is way beyond the pandemic, I guess, is what I'm saying. And the pandemic is almost kind of like a side point. If you can describe the COVID-19 pandemic as a side point, it's kind of almost like you know, it's just the context that's being used to do something that's had much longer history, and we need to think about what that means for 10, 15 years from now. And so that horizon, that temporal horizon, I think, kind of matters for the nature of how we think about the politics of it. But nonetheless, yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of questions about that. It's fascinating what you were saying about teach-ins and the way in which that becomes kind of exempt to it. You know, what's the answer to that? You know, the crowds are risky at the moment, and this comes through a whole bunch of our research. I mean, I'm not, you know, some of the public health stuff that we've looked at, you know, you kind of, people sort of say, well, actually, you know, this protest that people are up in arms about that happened, people wearing face masks and they're all fairly distanced, so it's actually fairly safe, but this one isn't. So how do you start to adjudicate and value between that? And I don't think, I mean, I think what's the way in which I would try to think about that is probably around how the government and the public discourse through a lot of the right-wing media has vilified particular kinds of protests. So there's certainly like a tendency to single out, for example, Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter protests in some of the conservative media as especially a problem. And this is partly why I mentioned Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, who described Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter as bringing anarchy to the streets. And there's been you know, protests that have happened where the government has been less vocal, and we saw the same thing in the US, for example, around sort of, you know, when Trump was in power, you know, condemning certain protests and not others, and so on. So I guess that, you know, that's kind of where I've tried to think about it, is around how the government selects particular kinds of protests, or the media select particular protests as a problem based on political predispositions and prejudices, and to focus more on the sort of permanent change. But yeah, I quite obviously don't have an answer to how to manage. I mean, I can talk about conceptual typologies for differentiating different types of crowds, but I'm not sure that's really what you're asking, right? I mean, I think you're asking about like the kind of politics of this and what we do about the very real notion that there are infection risks in crowds and how we think about that in the research. We've sort of not confronted it. You know, partly because we're looking at these longer term possible shifts that come out of it. So that's, yeah, I've got to think more about that, Kurt. Thank you. You also had a habit of asking questions which I kind of stumbled badly through, so thank you.
We have 2 more questions. We might take them together because I'm very aware of time. So the first one from Matt, and then excuse me, I can't. Athanas, you may have to help me. So Matt, we'll go to you next.
Thanks so much, Crystal and Colin, for a great presentation. It's clear the crowd, I can't speak either, is becoming a signifier for a kind of ominous presence. But I also wonder about the absences, and particularly the kind of intensity of gathering and diversity of gatherings that might inform a sense of place in a city and might even draw us, the mix and diversity of people and activities that might draw us to the city, and what the prospects are, or how you see that evolving or being present at all, given this kind of attitude towards crowding that you're observing in your work.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I mean, I'm glad you raised that actually, because I didn't really talk about it at all, but there was a kind of minor theme running through the interviews that we did where some people would kind of get quite nostalgic about crowds, and there was a sort of longing for crowds, and for the sort of, sometimes it was about the buzz of the city, so it wasn't necessarily crowds per se, but it was about that sense of just being amongst people, you know, in a kind of carefree way, you know, like not being worried about being thrown together with lots of people in shops and cafes and bars and restaurants and parks and, you know, kids' play areas or whatever it might be, but just being at ease and enjoying the hubbub of the kind of noise of the city. It was interesting that I think Boris Johnson actually said, you know, in the summer last year, something along those lines. He has a kind of knack for sort of trying to capture some of the mood around these things, but it was about you know we can get back to the buzz of British cities, and there was a kind of like a I mean, he has obviously all kinds of political reasons for saying this crap, but you know he's good at doing this sort of thing, and nonetheless, and a lot of the respondents talked about that. I wouldn't say most people. I said it was more likely that people would say, you know, I've resigned myself to never being comfortable in crowds again, and of course, well, not quite never ever, but for a long time. And what was kind of, I assumed that when vaccinations happened, because we've obviously got a really high rate of vaccinations in the UK, and I assumed that what would happen is that people would say, I'm fine now, and some people did, but actually most people didn't. Most people were still saying, you know, it's not even just a public health concern. It's just like psychologically feels difficult to put myself in a crowded position. You know, I'm not necessarily worried about getting infected. I can't be on a crowded train again. You know, I just can't imagine myself doing it. You know, and so coming back to what Crystal's question at the start, what's kind of encouraging about that, about the data that we got, was that people's positions do change over the pandemic. So you kind of think, well, actually, you leave it with some degree of optimism that people will feel eventually comfortable about going back and enjoying the things about urbanism that many of us are interested in and love about cities, you know, that kind of buzz and thrown togetherness and intensities that cities produce, because they are changeable perceptions. So I felt kind of encouraged, but I think it will be quite differentiated, you know, especially groups who see it who are perhaps more vulnerable, who've had a hard time of the pandemic. I think we'll find it harder to go back than others. And that's not necessarily, by the way, as a separate point, it's not necessarily vulnerable groups. There was also quite a lot of younger people who were very apprehensive about crowds as well in the interviews we did. So it wasn't only vulnerable groups. So it will take a long time for some people to go back. Does that? I'm not sure if that answers the question, Matt. Does that feel? Yeah.
And we're now going to go to our final question.
Thanks for that, Colin. That was a very interesting talk. I've only got two small comments, which I might have missed, said it at the beginning. But one was, does the government over there take any responsibility for pull factors? I mean, you mentioned some of the push factors, but there's a whole series of pull factors that their policies put in place, like zoning, the way they distribute employment hubs and what have you, which are always going to attract crowd, reducing density in one area, bringing the density to the other. And whether or not going forward, that's something that they would consider, knowing the consequences of everybody at a particular time in the morning all wanting to commute to a particular area and creating these conditions. The second part that I just wanted to mention was, and I think you just touched on it, about the way you could see a post-pandemic future, whether people go back. I noticed that it was in fact the crowds that celebrated the end of the restrictions over in the UK, and I believe also the same in the US, through some of the great sporting events, and the way in which they were covered in the media, how thousands and thousands of people could turn up at an event, big sporting festival, and celebrate and cheer and wave and what have you, signifying that on the one hand the crowd was a bad thing in the past, but here the crowd suggests that actually it's a good thing. And is that a step forward in realising the post-pandemic period?
Thanks for that. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that in terms of the kind of government's role in this, it was quite interesting that the government. See, I'm not sure how clear I made this point. Maybe I didn't make this point very well, but the government is very keen in Britain, has been very keen in Britain to get people back to commuting to work and into the office and into city centres. You know, that's been a really kind of like, you know, strong kind of like campaign from the government. Mainly because they're worried about city centre economies collapsing and, you know, all the kind of paraphernalia around the commute and getting people into the office, and they're worried about productivity and these kind of concerns. So, you know, economically, the government is comfortable with the production of crowds and busyness. And this goes back to the kind of Boris Johnson thing about buzz a little bit. But politically, they are very, they have I'm sure a public health concern, but also a political concern with crowds for some of the reasons that especially protests, for some of the reasons that I've talked about. And they've been, you know, really disappointed in their, or surprised even by the lack of return to offices and commuting. So after the third lockdown, which ended in, you know, end of winter, spring here, earlier this year, the numbers when we opened up, the numbers returning to the office wasn't really very much higher than during the lockdown. You know, something like 12% of office workers in London returned. It was like tiny percentages, and it hasn't really gone up very much. It's very slow progress, and so different parts of the country it's unequal. You know, Glasgow, for example, the city that I'm from, has the lowest rate of office return in the country, and it's, you know, led to wholesale closures of businesses in the city centre. They were servicing the service class effectively. So the government was wanting to see those densities and those commutes back in action, and haven't. So now they've kind of gone a bit quieter on this, and my sense is that the government is now thinking about what the new economy might look like, and what they can do to support a more distantiated economy where people are working from home, where there's a different kind of purpose to city centres, potentially different kinds of, you know, and city councils are doing that. So Newcastle City Council, my city where I live, there is a very concerted effort by the local council to sort of to shift the city centre into a kind of like social sort of leisure space that is much greener, that has much more outdoor sitting. Whether you want to sit outdoors in Newcastle at any point for any length of time is a separate question, but the City Council trying to rebalance city centres in quite a significant way. So I don't think the government sees itself as having a responsibility for this. I think the government sees itself as kind of, you know, as responding to the market, as sort of in acceptance mode that the market's not going back to the way it was, and it needs to then think about how to infrastructure the market as it's emerging. And I've just forgotten the second part of the question. Sorry. That may be
I actually, it was more a comment about the way in which crowds are now being used to celebrate the end of the lockdown. Where they were a negative previously, now they appear to be positive, and it's really obvious, especially in the US. I think there's a famous clip that's doing the rounds of the opening of the National College Football season, where I think 80,000 people all crowded into a stadium and were jumping and laughing and dancing. And I think the same happened with the start of the Premier League back over there. The idea that this is the negativity to the crowd that people saw during the whole pandemic period is being shifted to saying, look, we're celebrating it.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, well, we are currently planning our sort of next round of kind of, because it's a good moment to do it, the next round of sort of interviews and research on the kind of pandemic crowd biography stuff. And it's precisely these questions which are in our minds now, is that, you know, football stadiums are full now. There is a kind of, I'm not sure about, I don't know whether it's a celebration, but there's certainly a coming together in certain places now in a more routine way. We saw it during the European Championships as well over the summer, and quite heated debates about it. So, for example, you know, yes, you can have sporting crowds, but you can't have groups of school kids gathering at a school event because of spatial restrictions that maintain in the educational environment, things like that. So there's a kind of playing out of different types of crowds now and different types of permissibility and different speculations about what's safe and what isn't. You know, an outdoor football crowd is seen to be safe. An indoor group in a sporting arena is seen to be a problem. You know, so there's these kind of contradictions around different kinds of crowds. And I think what's important here is the outdoor-indoor thing, and this is something that we've picked up in something else that we're writing, is the ways in which you know, a crowd outdoors has very different kinds of attachments projected onto it than a crowd indoors in terms of safety and risk and permissibility and regulations that go around that. So that's kind of our next sort of stage of the work, is my kind of cop-out answer to that, but I think it's an important point, yeah, we'll be picking up on it, so thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions, and thank you especially to Colin for such a captivating presentation and discussion. I probably am not alone in looking forward to all the outputs from this research and staying abreast of your findings, as our relationship to crowds no doubt shifts and changes during this very long pandemic. I just want to use this as a moment to just quickly say that we have another speaker on November 3rd, Fran Tonkis from the London School of Economics. So if you'd like to join us for that event, please have a look at our website. You can sign up there. So Colin, once again, thank you very much. And everyone join me in thanking Colin for his time and for getting up so early.
Thank you. Thanks, Crystal. Thanks to everyone who's organised this. It's been a real pleasure. So thank you.